This lesson is about credible sources. We're going to start with a cartoon because you all know how I love editorial cartoons. And so when we're looking at this cartoon, we're going to look at the four corners to describe it. And so we see this man sitting behind a table with stacks of books. We see a sign that says, "Meet the author, James Fry, A Million Little Pieces," in quotation marks. We see people lined up with a rope cord to keep them in place. And then one man is standing at the table, and he walks up and he says, "As a recovering addict, I was inspired by your memoir demonstrating that there are no quick fixes on the road to recovery." And then the author says, "I made it all up." And the guy goes, "Ben, do you know where I can get a quick fix?" To explain this cartoon, you would have to know who James Fry is. James Fry wrote the book A Million Little Pieces, and he wrote the book and published it as an autobiography about his road to recovery and how he struggled and survived. He went on talk shows, most notably he was on Oprah Winfrey's show, and Oprah gave away his book, was very inspired and moved by his story. And then it came out that he actually made most of it up. He lost all of his credibility. The second cartoon, we have a husband and wife in bed. The wife is reading the gossip magazine, and the man is reading A Billion Tiny Pieces. And he turns to his wife and he says, "It's James Fry's first-hand account of the current condition of his credibility." That's what happens when you make up stories, when you lie, when you fabricate, when you mislead. You lose your credibility. So evaluating sources. When you evaluate sources, you look at the relevance, the evidence, the authorship, the publisher, the timeliness, the comprehensiveness, and the genre. So for relevance, you would ask, is it relevant? Is it tied to the headline? Is it relevant to what I'm looking for? Evidence, you ask yourself, what data, statistics, sources, what evidence does the author incorporate and use in his or her writing? Authorship, you ask about the author. If a site or source doesn't have an author, you should ask why. Sometimes, although very limited in small cases, but sometimes the author is anonymous for a reason, and that shouldn't necessarily discount the source. However, most of the time it does. And then the publisher. Who's the publisher? Is it an authority in the field? Is it some off-brand type of website? Who is publishing this information? And what are the motivations behind the publisher? You always follow the money. Timeliness. Is it current event? Or if you're researching a current event, you want current information. However, don't fall into the trap of believing that a source has to be from this past month. Depending on your topic, your sources might be older. And then comprehensiveness. How comprehensive did the author get in writing the article or the source? And then the genre. So let's take a look at the segment from history.com, and it's a segment on the Silver Bridge collapse.
The Point Pleasant Bridge, which spanned the border between southern Ohio and West Virginia, was filled with commuters and Christmas shoppers on the afternoon of December 16, 1967. Suddenly, the bridge collapsed, sending dozens of cars and passengers into the frigid waters of the Ohio River. The death toll would ultimately reach 46, the worst loss of life from a bridge accident in American history.
The bridge was built in 1928, and it came down in 1967. One has to ask, how could a bridge exist for almost 40 years and all of a sudden collapse?
The mysterious collapse of the Point Pleasant Bridge can be traced to its unusual construction nearly 4 decades earlier. Unlike classic suspension bridges like the Golden Gate, which are linked by hundreds of wound steel cables, Point Pleasant's construction was of a type similar to Pittsburgh's 6th Street Bridge, which was constructed at the same time, and whose suspension depended on parallel chains of steel eye-bars.
Each end of the eye-bar are holes through which pins are passed. So it's a series of straight links that are pinned to articulate and achieve more or less the curve of a suspension bridge.
Was very strong material. This allowed them to build the bridge in a very light fashion so that they could have long, lightweight elements in the bridge.
Coated with shiny aluminum paint, Point Pleasant became known as the Silver Bridge, an elegant and aesthetically pleasing structure 1,460 feet long. But unlike the cables of a traditional suspension bridge, the Silver Bridge eye-bars provided no redundant means of support. Instead, they formed a chain, which proved to be only as strong as its weakest link.
But if one significant part fails, the entire bridge will collapse. I don't know when that concept became well known, but it must not have been practiced in the 1920s.
After examining the wreckage from the Ohio River, a team from the National Bureau of Standards, now known as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, created this model of the Silver Bridge. They determined that the fatal fissure occurred at one end of eye-bar number 330, the result of a 1/8 inch crack caused by decades of corrosion. When the eye-bar finally broke, the force of the fracture loosened the connecting pin in the joint where the break occurred, allowing the other eye-bars to slip out, breaking the chain of suspension, dropping the roadbed, and collapsing the bridge.
This is where the brittle fracture occurred. Actually, it's been removed for microscopic examination, but it was very flat, just like this.
The Silver Bridge eye-bars were made of heat-treated medium-high carbon steel, an unusually strong but brittle metal that is susceptible to cracking from natural corrosion. But the covered joints where the fatal fracture occurred were concealed from view during routine inspections of the bridge.
The last real inspection was back in 1951. Apparently this was done by someone looking at the bridge with binoculars from the ground. So again, we have a maintenance problem for sure.
The collapse of the Silver Bridge led to a systematic inspection of bridges throughout the country for the first time in U.S. history. Many older bridges were either dismantled or retrofitted to meet new safety guidelines.
There was a general looking at bridges to examine their redundancy and their susceptibility to this kind of failure. It certainly had an impact on all future bridges that were built, so they never built one like this again. For microscopic examination, but it was very flat, just like this.
The Silver Bridge eye-bars were made of heat-treated medium-high carbon steel, an unusually strong but brittle metal that is susceptible to cracking from natural corrosion. But the covered joints where the fatal fracture occurred were concealed from view during routine inspections of the bridge.
The last real inspection was back in 1951. Apparently this was done by someone looking at the bridge with binoculars from the ground. So again, we have a maintenance problem for sure.
The collapse of the Silver Bridge led to a systematic inspection of bridges throughout the country for the first time in... Unlike classic suspension bridges like the Golden Gate, which are linked by hundreds of wound steel cables, Point Pleasant's construction was of a type similar to Pittsburgh's 6th Street Bridge, which was constructed at the same time, and whose suspension depended on parallel chains of steel eye-bars.
Each end of the eye-bar are holes through which pins are passed. So it's a series of straight links that are pinned to articulate and achieve more or less the curve of a suspension bridge.
was very strong material. This allowed them to build the bridge in a very light fashion so that they could have long, lightweight elements in the bridge.
Coated with shiny aluminum paint, Point Pleasant became known as the Silver Bridge, an elegant and aesthetically pleasing structure 1,460 feet long. But unlike the cables of a traditional suspension bridge, the Silver Bridge eye-bars provided no redundant means of support. Instead, they formed a chain, which proved to be only as strong as its weakest link.
But if one significant part fails, the entire bridge will collapse. I don't know when that concept became well known, but it must not have been practiced in the 1920s.
So the evidence, or the video that we saw with history.com, is looking at the collapse of the Silver Bridge, and it's filmed in a documentary type style. It's from History Channel, history.com, which may be a little suspicious given the prior programming or current programming that's on the History Channel. However, the content and the information is actually science-based. It talks about the bridge collapsing and how the bridge collapsed, and it goes into a lot of details. So that would be a really good site. Next, let's take a look at Bill's channel. Bill is a YouTuber, and he does oddities, curiosities, and so forth, and he's got a video on Mothman.
Hey guys, Bill here. You know, there's a lot of different types of animals in this world. We have the friendly types, and then there's the not so friendly types. But then there's the ones we don't know really what they are. Like this one they call the Mothman. According to eyewitnesses, the Mothman has giant wings and big red eyes. It stands taller than a man, but flies faster than any bird we know. There have been dozens of news reports and documentaries about the Mothman, even a major motion picture. But is the Mothman real, or is it fake? That's what I'm wondering. This is Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It's a quiet town that sits on the Ohio River. But right in the center of town is a large sculpture of what locals call the Big Bird, or Mothman. It is here because Point Pleasant is where the legend of Mothman really got its start. On the night of November 15, 1966, two young couples were out in an area called the TNT by locals. TNT is an old World War II munitions storage area that was converted to a wildlife sanctuary after the war, and a favorite haunt for local kids to park and party. On this night, however, the four young people in the car were on their way out of the woods when suddenly they came across something very unusual standing in the middle of the road. According to the kids, it had a 10-foot wingspan and red glowing eyes the size of baseballs. This is the place right here where the kids said they were standing. They said the creature took off in this direction where there was a large building. They didn't chase after it. Instead, they pointed their car towards town and hit the gas pedal. On the main highway back to town, the creature appeared again, flying above the car as it was chasing them. They tried to outrun it, but despite hitting speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour, the creature stayed right with them. Only when they came to a lit area of town did the creature turn off and disappear. The kids told the police what they had seen, but the story wasn't taken seriously until reports of other sightings began to pour in. In all, over 100 reports from eyewitnesses were filed, and this caught the attention of the news media.
Well, what did you see?
I don't know. I was looking at it in the sky, and then all of a sudden it just, just sort of sank right into the tree,
So he stopped the car and the thing came over top of the car.
Now, I have to point out that nobody was ever actually harmed by the Mothman, but many people believe that's because the Mothman was not so much a monster as it was a prophet of doom.
Shut up! You're not going to at this. The whole bridge just collapsed. Yeah, the bridge has collapsed.
About a week after someone reported seeing Mothman on Point Pleasant's main bridge, the whole structure collapsed into the Ohio River, killing 46 people. That's why so many people believe that the Mothman is more like the Grim Reaper, a creature that is there to warn you that bad things are about to happen. Now, the odd thing about this, and something that gives credence to this point of view of Mothman, is the fact that once the bridge collapsed, so did the sightings of Mothman. And that gets me back to my original question. Is it a real creature or isn't it?
Yeah, I believe that there was something going on up there in the TNT area, that people were actually seeing something. Too many people seeing it, too many people describing the same thing.
Jeff Walmsley, who wrote a book about Mothman, seems to think there's something to this story. But author and professor of anthropology Jeffrey McKee is very skeptical.
The chances of something like this being real are incredibly slim. We've had biologists scouring the earth for centuries, and no one has seen something like this Mothman.
He's got a good point there. I mean, is there some hard evidence?
To my knowledge, there has never been anything other than eyewitness descriptions and drawings, sketches, as to a good description of this thing.
But then again, how would you explain 100 people seeing this thing and it not being true?
Well, you have more than 100 people who claim to have seen Bigfoot, and no one's ever found any definitive evidence. No one's ever found any real footprints. No one's ever found any DNA. No one's found anything. We have evolved for millions of years to be able to try and take the world as we see it and make sense of it. And sometimes the way we make sense of it in the long run doesn't make sense.
Now, there is one reasonable explanation I did come across in my research, and that is there's a possibility that what these people were really seeing were actual birds. You see, the area around Point Pleasant is filled with all sorts of large winged birds, like sandhill cranes, barred owls, even turkey vultures.
They look pretty small when they're up in the sky, but when they swoop down, you see they have a 6-foot wingspan and they look really, really big all of a sudden.
Another interpretation of Mothman that I heard about came from a man named John Keel. He wrote a book called The Mothman Prophecies that was turned into a major motion picture starring Richard Gere.
His take on the whole thing was this was related to the UFO activity, that this Mothman creature somehow, and the men in black and the UFOs were all related. He felt that the TNT area was a window to paranormal activity.
An alien from outer space. Well, that would be really cool. But first of all, we'd have to have evidence that it exists. And secondly, why would an alien from outer space look like anything we have here on Earth? An alien from outer space would be totally different from what we have here on Earth, because they would have had a completely different evolutionary trajectory. They might not even be carbon-based, for that matter. For an alien to look like an Earth creature would be highly unlikely.
Now, I know I'm just touching on the tip of the iceberg of this story, and I want to apologize to the experts who know so much more than I do. But based on what little I do know, this creature known as the Mothman is and will remain an open book, unfortunately, as in unsolved mystery. I'm sorry, but I don't feel like I have enough evidence to prove it one way or another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it up to you guys. What do you think? Do you think Mothman is real? Or maybe it's just a figment of people's paranoid imaginations? Maybe it's a UFO. Or maybe it's just a bird that ate too much McDonald's. Let me know what you think in the comments section below for a chance to win a free t-shirt. That's right, that's what I just said. A free t-shirt for the first 5 commenters who mention the words Mothman and t-shirt in their opinion will get to pick the t-shirt of their choice off the Mothman Museum website in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. So get typing, be a winner, and I'll see you next time.
Okay, don't forget, you have to be 18 years or older to win a t-shirt, and you have to live in a place where we can actually send it to you. In other words, if you live at the top of the Himalayas and we can't send it to you because there is no mailman, then we won't be able to fulfill our end of the agreement. Sorry about that.
So if we look at Bill and his video, it actually has some inconsistencies and some problems with it. The story we know is different because we've looked at the police reports and discussed that. We know that sure, there could have been 100+ people who saw Mothman, but it doesn't make it real. Then we have Jeff Wamsley, who is the owner of the Mothman Museum and also the co-author of the book. Then we have the scientist who actually is the most credible in the video. So we can look at this and actually look at the credibility of it. However, it doesn't necessarily diminish Bill's credibility depending on the purpose of what we're using it for, if that makes sense. It's a shame at the end of the video, Mothman doesn't exist, and he should have said that. He knows it doesn't exist, and the reasoning is we know it's not a sandhill crane from definition. We know it's not a prophecy from aliens. And so there are some problems with him and his credibility. However, for entertainment purposes, it's a good video. Then we have a news story. This news story, there's the link to it from WCHS Channel 8 Eyewitness News, and the headline says, "Man photographs creature that resembles legendary Mothman of Point Pleasant." And so when we look at the article itself, we can find some problems with it, and looking at the sightings of Mothman ended. They're not saying Mothman, but it is interesting to look at these old, or they're actually current news stories, and compare them with the old news stories, and then ask ourselves, well, why are we suddenly seeing this creature? Well, why are we? Again, credibility. Things to look for in articles. Look for spelling. If there's incorrect spelling, then question the writer, the journalist, the author. They should know how to spell. Punctuation. Incorrect punctuation is also a red flag that goes up. And then errors in facts. Sometimes journalists, writers get something wrong. Okay. But sometimes if it's a lot of things they're getting wrong, then they're just not a credible source. If it's not a credible source, don't use it. Wikipedia. By now you know that I do not like Wikipedia in terms of academic scholarship and research. It is a generalist encyclopedia, and it actually has a lot of errors in a lot of the articles. And so it is a communal encyclopedia that anyone can edit, which is problematic. The person who is editing the entries isn't signing their name to it, and a lot of the content in Wikipedia is taken from the legitimate source. Yes, people like Wikipedia because it's free and it's collaborative, and they like that as a selling feature, but it really isn't. And so Wikipedia, some more information from their website, is free content. Again, there's the old adage, when you get something free, you should question it. There's never, what is it? Something about there aren't any free lunches or anything, something like that. It escapes me right now, but think of that. It's written collaboratively by volunteers. When people are volunteers and they're not being paid, that should be suspicious. The project began on January 15th, 2001. It has more than 3 million articles. That's fabulous. But just because it has a lot of articles doesn't mean that the articles are accurate. Again, it has almost 900,000 users. Just because they're registered doesn't mean they know the truth. does not mean that they aren't copying and pasting either. And they had Wikipedia has risen in popularity. However, it's risen in popularity because they pay for placement on the search engines. So we're going to follow up with Oprah. Remember how I told you how James Fry was on Oprah's couch talking about his story, this autobiographical story about his road to recovery? We have this cartoon from Prickly City, and this is a little girl and her playmate, and he comes running out. She makes the sun to rise and books to sell. And he goes up to the little girl, you know my novel? And she's like, the one you wrote with a Sharpie and 6 rolls of toilet paper? It's #1 on Amazon.com. I've sold over 30 million copies, thanks to her. And the little girl goes, Oprah really is omnipotent. And he goes, and then some. And then the follow-up to the follow-up. Prickly City, he's sitting on the chair on Oprah's stage, and he goes, okay, so parts of a little million coyotes may not exactly be true. And then you hear Oprah angry. Oprah feels duped. And he's like, looky, I'm jumping on your couch. Cute, huh? Disappear him. Oprah wills it. And he gulps. Where's Phil Donahue when you need him? This is actually referring to Tom Cruise when he was bouncing on Oprah's couch to proclaim his love for Katie Holmes. But it also is a really good antidote. Don't lie to Oprah, but don't lie to the people. Look at your your sources, evaluate their credibility, and you're going to do that with the annotated bibliography. But it shouldn't stop there. You should be questioning sources. It's okay to question. That's part of human nature. Anyhow, that's it for the lesson.